The wind had been stripping bark from trees for 6 hours. That was the detail Decker Holt kept returning to as his legs began their slow negotiation with the idea of stopping. Not the cold itself, which had moved past sensation into something more administrative, more like a system gradually powering down than anything he would have called pain. Not the fact that the heating elements in all four sets of riding gear had failed within 40 minutes of each other in a way that was not mechanical failure and was not coincidence. Not even the snow, which had gone horizontal somewhere around the second hour and had not returned to anything resembling vertical since. What he kept returning to was the trees. He had ridden Crestfall Pass in October 3 years running, and he knew what the aspens looked like in the fall, that particular gold that has no equivalent anywhere in a man's experience, except possibly the memory of something he loved when he was young and understood imperfectly. He knew what the pines looked like under the first snow of the season, the way they held it in their upper branches, like something they intended to keep. He knew this mountain the way a man knows a place he has returned to willingly across years, which is to say he knew it with the trust of someone who had never been given a reason not to trust it. The wind running through Crestfall Pass for the last 6 hours had stripped bark from 3 aspens he could see from where he had come off the road, stripped it clean in long, pale curls that lay in the snow like shed skin. He had noticed this 40 minutes ago when he first understood that walking was going to be necessary, and he had not stopped noticing it since. The mountain was doing something to itself tonight that it had not done in the 3 years he had been coming here. It was unmaking things. He was 6 feet 6 inches tall and weighed 285 pounds. He had spent 4 years as a heavy weapons specialist with the 10th Mountain Division, an assignment that selected for men who were comfortable in exactly this terrain, under exactly these conditions, and he had subsequently spent a decade as the enforcer of the Iron Pass chapter of a motorcycle club that operated across 6 states and had never in his experience of it lacked for men willing to go into difficult places for the right reasons. He had a jaw like load-bearing architecture and hands that had closed around things over the years that did not benefit from being closed around, and the particular stillness of someone who has learned that most situations do not require movement and has internalized that lesson at a cellular level. He had been actively dying for 40 minutes. The sabotage had been professional. Someone had gotten to their gear before the pass, stripped the battery seals on all 4 sets of heated riding equipment, punctured the thermal underlayer in the saddlebag emergency kits, and done both with a precision that left no visible evidence until the cold was already internal. In a storm that had come in 3 hours ahead of any forecast on a pass that offered nothing in the way of shelter for 4 miles in either direction, losing your heated gear was not an inconvenience. It was a sentence, and the sentence was being carried out at the pace of hypothermia, which is the pace of something that wants to be mistaken for sleep. Rex had made it off his bike first, consistent with his general approach to situations involving immediate physical danger, which was to assess and move before most people had finished assessing. Boone had gone into a snowbank at the 3rd switchback when his front wheel found ice under the fresh accumulation, but he had come out of it with nothing broken, in the focused calm of a man who has decided the current situation is manageable and has set aside all evidence to the contrary. Harlan was the one Decker had worried about. Harlan was the biggest of them, 6'4", and built like something structural, and the cold had gotten into him differently than the others. Something in the geometry of the storm and the direction he had been riding when the heating elements failed, and for the last 20 minutes of walking, Harlan had been leaning on Boone in a way that was not theatrical. Decker had managed to keep them moving. This was, in his assessment, the only thing he had managed in the last 2 hours that qualified as a success, and he was aware it was a diminishing one. They had come off the road at the first break in the guardrail and moved east through the tree line, because east was downhill in a gradual way that did not require any of them to make decisions. Their bodies were no longer fully equipped to make. He had a compass because he always had a compass. He had a lighter that still worked because he kept it in his inside left pocket against his chest, where the cold could not reach the fluid. He did not have a fire because there was nowhere to build one and nothing dry enough to build it with, and the wind would have taken it anyway. He was on one knee in the snow when he heard the voice. It should not have been audible. The wind was doing things to sound in the past that were not natural, pulling it in directions that served the wind, rather than anyone trying to communicate across open ground. And the voice was thin and high and working hard to carry over all of it. It should have been swallowed by the storm, the way the storm had swallowed everything else that came up this mountain unprepared tonight. It should have been nothing. He heard it. In the margin between the gray, nothing that had been pulling at the edges of his vision for the last 30 minutes, and whatever remained of functional consciousness, he heard it. Come inside. The words were almost shapeless by the time they reached him, worn down to consonants by the wind, but they were words, and they were directed at him, and they came with light. Not much light. The weak amber of a single kerosene lamp in a window, the kind of light that says occupied rather than warm, that carries no heat through glass and wind and sub-zero air. But it was light, and below it stood a small figure in the open doorway, coatless in the cold, waving one arm in the unmistakable gesture of someone who needs to be seen. Decker Holt had been, for the last 40 minutes, actively losing a fight with a mountain. He looked at the light. He looked at the figure. He got his knee out of the snow. He did not know later with any precision how he covered the last 60 yards. He knew that Rex had come up on his left and taken some portion of his weight without being asked, and he knew that the small figure had left the doorway and come out into the snow to meet them, which he registered with the part of his brain still running threat assessment and filed under improbable. The figure came up to the middle of his chest. When it reached him, it put both hands on his left arm, fingers pale with cold grip, surprisingly firm, and it pulled. He went forward. The door was there. And then 3 walls and a roof were between him and the storm, and Decker Holt stood in a room that was 8 feet by 10 feet and contained almost nothing, and he was alive. He cataloged the room automatically, completely without choosing to. 1 window, 1 door, both facing west. A fireplace built into the east wall iron grate, cold ash in the pan from a fire that had gone out some hours ago. A cot against the north wall made with a precision that spoke of someone who had few things and took care of all of them. A wooden chair, a small table. On the table, a kerosene lamp and a single can of soup. On the wall above the cot, a photograph, a man and a woman, and a small child younger than the child now standing beside him, all 3 of them in front of a mountain he recognized as the same one currently trying to kill him. The man in the photograph had his arm around the woman, and in his other hand he held an acoustic guitar, old and dark finished, the wood worn down around the sound hole from years of playing. Beside the photograph, hung from a wooden peg, was the guitar itself. That was everything. That was the full inventory of what existed in this room and in the life of the person who occupied it. Decker looked at the child. She was 8 years old. She had gray eyes and dark hair, cut practically rather than stylishly, and she was already moving, already crossing to the fireplace, with the iron poker in her hand, crouching in front of the cold grate, with the economy of someone who had done this before and intended to do it correctly. Her name, he would learn in the next 5 minutes, was Nora Aldridge. He would spend considerable time in the years that followed thinking about what she did in the next 15 minutes, and he would never find a single word for it, because the word would have to contain both the practical and the moral, the physical act, and the decision behind it, and most words were built for one or the other. "There's no wood," she said. She said it without looking up and without complaint, in the tone of someone who has already moved past the problem to its solution. She stood. She crossed to the wooden chair. She looked at it for a moment, just a moment, the look of someone completing a transaction with themselves, and then she lifted it and swung it against the edge of the fireplace. It broke well. She broke it again. She stacked the pieces in the grate with careful architecture, smaller pieces at the base and larger ones above, in a way that would allow air to move through. She held the poker in the flame of the kerosene lamp until it was hot enough, and she touched it to the base of the wood, and the fire started. Rex had made it through the door on his own. Boone and Harlan had made it between them, leaning on each other with the mutual dependence of men who have learned that dignity is a resource to be managed rather than defended at all costs. All 4 of them were on the floor now, as close to the growing fire as the space allowed the heat working into them in the slow and painful way that warmth works when the cold has gone deep enough to mean something. Nora went to the table. She opened the can of soup. She had a small pot, one pot Decker noted one pot, and two mismatched bowls, and she poured the soup in and held it over the fire on a metal rod bent for exactly this purpose. It was a practiced arrangement. She had done this before. It's not much, she said. She wasn't apologizing. She was being accurate. It's everything, Decker said. His voice came out rougher than he intended, the cold having done something to his throat that would take a day or two to undo. He looked at her. What's your name, Nora? She watched the soup without looking at him. What's yours, Decker? He paused. The others are Rex, Boone, and Harlan. She repeated each name quietly once, as if placing them somewhere specific. Then she said, my papa always said you should know the name of anyone you let into your home. He sounds like he knew what he was talking about. A pause, long enough to be deliberate. He died 2 years ago. Mama, too. It was the winter fever. She said it without flinching in the way that children say true things when they have fully processed the truth of them. Not without feeling, without the need to perform the feeling for whoever was listening. Decker looked at the photograph on the wall. The man with the guitar, the woman beside him, the mountain behind them, both the same mountain in a different season without the storm. I'm sorry, he said. She shook her head slightly. He wouldn't have wanted sorry. He would have wanted the soup to be warmer. The soup came to a low simmer. She poured it into the two bowls with the precision of someone for whom nothing could be wasted, and she brought one to Decker and held it out. He looked at it. He looked at her. You take it, he said. She shook her head. You were outside longer. He met her eyes. They were gray and direct and carried the steadiness of someone who has made a decision and does not require external confirmation of it. He thought about arguing. He understood looking at her that arguing would not produce a different outcome. We split it, he said. She sat beside him close to the fire, and they divided the bowl between them. Behind them, Rex and Boone and Harlan had begun the slow process of returning to themselves color, coming back into their faces in degrees the silence of men who understand they came close to something and are not yet ready to discuss it. Decker drank his half of the soup. It was tomato from a can heated over a fireplace, in a room with no insulation on a mountain in the middle of a blizzard. He had eaten in restaurants that charged significant amounts of money for meals that did not do for him what that half bowl of soup did. He understood the mathematics were not about the soup. He looked around the room again. One bowl, one can, the broken chair in the grate. He looked at the guitar on the wall. He looked at Nora. She was watching the fire, her knees pulled up to her chest, her arms wrapped around them, the posture of someone who has learned to contain her own warmth, because there is not always another source available. She was 8 years old. She had 4 adult strangers on her floor and a broken chair in her fireplace, and half a can of soup in her stomach, and the expression on her face was one of careful, complete, undemonstrative composure. Decker had been in situations over the course of his adult life that were described afterward by the people in them as difficult. He had been in places where the only available options were bad and worse, and he had learned in those places what composure actually looked like. Not the perform version most people produced under pressure, but the real thing, the kind that did not require an audience and did not change based on whether anyone was watching. He recognized it when he saw it. He was looking at it now in an 8-year-old girl on a mountain in a snowstorm, and something in the recognition moved in him that he was not prepared for and did not immediately have a name for. It was much later. Rex was asleep against the south wall. Boone and Harlan had pulled into the corner near the fire and were breathing the slow, deep rhythm of men whose bodies had decided the crisis portion of the evening was over and had begun the work of repair without waiting for permission. The fire had settled from its initial urgency into something steadier, a banked warmth doing the room genuine good. Nora had fallen asleep in the corner wrapped in Decker's cut, which was the warmest thing in the room despite being damp from the snow, and which came down to her knees and covered her hands and had the iron pass patch on the back facing outward into the room. She had fallen asleep the way children fall asleep when they are finally completely safe without stages, without transition, one moment present and the next entirely gone. Decker sat by the fire and did not sleep. He looked at the photograph on the wall, the man and the woman, the mountain in a different season. He looked at the guitar beside it, the old acoustic with the worn finish, the wood smooth around the sound hole from years of use, the instrument of someone who had played not occasionally but constantly, the way people play when music is not a hobby but a habit of thought. He looked at Nora in the corner, and he looked at the broken chair in the grate, and he held both things in his mind at the same time, without trying to resolve the distance between them. He was running calculations that were not comfortable to run. The sabotage on the mountain had been professional, which meant it had been personal, which meant someone had known their route and their timing and had access to their gear before the pass. That was a problem with a specific shape and specific implications, and he would address it when he was off the mountain and in a position to address things. That problem was not the one keeping him awake. The problem keeping him awake was in his left jacket pocket. He had found it when he helped Nora adjust the cut around her shoulders before she fell asleep. It had slipped from the pocket of her jacket, the thin, inadequate jacket hanging on the peg beside the door, and fallen to the floor, and he had picked it up automatically and looked at it before he fully understood what he was looking at. It was not a legal document. He knew what legal documents looked like. He had seen enough of them across enough years to recognize one and to recognize the absence of one. This was a letter printed on county letterhead signed by a deputy named Craw Denton, dated 3 weeks ago. The language was bureaucratic and careful, the language of someone who had learned to say things in ways that did not constitute direct statements. The property designated as the Aldridge parcel, Crestfall County parcel number 4471-B, had been assessed as abandoned and eligible for county reclamation under statute 18-4. The current occupant, if any such occupant existed, was advised that the structure would be subject to demolition on the date specified at the bottom of the letter. The date at the bottom of the letter was tomorrow. Decker read it twice. He looked at Nora in the corner. He looked at the guitar on the wall, the photograph beside it, the broken chair in the grate. He looked at the single empty can on the table. She had known. She had been sitting with this letter for 3 weeks, and she had not run, and she had not asked anyone for help. And she had spent tonight, the last night before the deadline, opening her door in a blizzard to pull 4 strangers out of a storm. She had given them her chair and her fire and her last can of soup, and her father's guitar was still on the wall untouched because she had given the chair first, and the chair had been enough, and she had not touched the guitar because a person only burns what they have to. Decker sat with this for a long time. There was something he had been carrying for 7 years that he had never fully put down. His daughter's name had been Maisie, and she had been 3 years old, and the accident had been on a Tuesday in November on a road he had driven 100 times. And it had not been his fault in any way that an investigation or an insurance company or a court of law would have recognized. And it had been his fault in the way that a father carries fault, which is a different jurisdiction entirely and one from which there is no appeal. He had not been present. He had been 300 miles away on chapter business, and his wife had been driving and the ice had been there, and none of those facts changed the central fact, which was that his daughter had been 3 years old, and he had not been there, and she was gone. He had spent 7 years becoming very good at not thinking about this. He had become so good at it that he had almost convinced himself that the not thinking was the same as the not feeling, which is the kind of logic that works until it doesn't. He looked at Nora Aldridge sleeping in his cut on the floor of a single-room shack in a blizzard on a mountain that had tried to kill him tonight, and he felt something shift in the specific place where he kept things he had decided not to feel, and the shift was not comfortable, and he did not look away from it. He reached for the satellite phone in his inside chest pocket, the one thing that had survived the cold intact because it had spent the last 6 hours pressed against his body. He turned it on. It connected after a moment that felt longer than it was. The voice that answered was immediate. Garrett Maddox Stone to the chapter and to everyone who had ridden with him for the 20 years he had been president of Iron Pass did not waste time on questions when his enforcer called from a mountain in a blizzard at 3 in the morning. He answered on the second ring and said one word: talk. Decker talked. He told it the way he told everything in order without editorializing. starting with the sabotage and moving through the pass and the cold and the shack and the girl. And when he got to the letter, he read it out loud, word for word, including the date at the bottom. Stone was quiet for 4 seconds. This was in Decker's experience a significant amount of quiet from Stone, who was not a man given to silence when action was available. "Give me the coordinates," Stone said. Decker gave them. Another pause. Shorter. "We'll be there before first light," Stone said. And then with an emphasis that meant something specific in the language of people who had ridden together long enough to develop one all of us. Decker understood what that meant. All of us meant Stone had already done the calculation and arrived at a number that was not simply the number of people who happened to be available tonight. All of us meant Stone was going to make calls between now and first light to people who owed Decker things, and some of those people were going to get on bikes in the middle of the night in a dying storm, because that was what all of us meant when a debt was owed and a night had come for payment. Decker clicked off. He looked at the fire. He looked at Nora in the corner. He thought about what she had done tonight and tried to find a framework for it that was adequate. Not a framework of sentiment. He had no use for sentiment, and she, he suspected, had even less, but a framework of fact. She was 8 years old. She was alone. She had nothing in the world that she had not held on to with both hands, and tonight she had opened her hands and given it. She had done it without drama and without calculation and without any visible expectation of return. She had done it because a voice in the dark outside her door had been a voice in need, and she had made a decision about what that meant and acted on it. He had been in places over the course of his life where the word brave got used with some regularity. He had learned in those places to be suspicious of the word because it was frequently applied to things that were actually adrenaline or training or the narrowing of options that makes a difficult choice feel simple because it is the only remaining choice. He had met genuinely brave people in those places and had noticed that they almost never used the word about themselves, and that what distinguished them from the others was not the absence of fear, but the presence of a decision made clearly and without ambiguity about what the fear was worth. Nora Aldridge had made that decision tonight in the doorway of a single-room shack on a mountain in a blizzard. She had made it at 8 years old alone with no one watching, with everything she had on the line. He looked at the letter in his hand. He looked at the date. Tomorrow. He added the last piece of the broken chair to the fire and watched the flame catch. The guitar was still on the wall. The photograph was still beside it. The man with the guitar and the woman beside him and the mountain behind them in a different season, when there were 3 of them instead of 1. He would not let them take the house. This was not a decision he made the way he made most decisions, by running the variables and assessing the outcomes and selecting the approach most likely to produce the desired result. It was not a decision at all in the ordinary sense. It was more like a recognition, the recognition of something already true from the moment he read the date on the letter. Something that did not require deliberation, because it was not the kind of thing deliberation could change. Outside, the storm was doing what storms do when they have run the length of their energy and are beginning finally the long, slow work of ending. The wind was still there, but something in its character had shifted from purpose to habit. The snow had eased from horizontal to something closer to diagonal. The mountain was still dark and still cold and still very large, but it was no longer unmaking things. Decker Holt sat by the fire in the only warm room on Crestfall Pass and watched Nora Aldridge sleep in his cut and thought about debts, about what it meant to owe something to someone, about the obligation that exists when what you owe can never be fully repaid, and you know it, and you choose to begin the payment anyway, because beginning is the only dignified response to that kind of debt. From the corner, Nora made a small sound in her sleep. She pulled the cut tighter around her chin without waking. The iron pass patch on the back of it faced the room. Decker watched the fire and waited for first light. Clifton Voss had not built his career on luck. He was careful to believe this, and careful to repeat it to himself in moments like this one, sitting in the heated front seat of his county-issue Suburban, with a thermos of coffee that had cost more per pound than most people in Crestfall County spent on a week of groceries, watching the pre-dawn dark on the mountain road, with the satisfaction of a man who has arranged things correctly and is now simply waiting for the arrangement to produce its expected result. Luck was what people called the outcomes of other people's preparation. What Voss had was preparation. What Voss had was relationships cultivated over 2 decades with the patience of someone who understood that money was not itself power, but was the most reliable converter of effort into power that human civilization had yet produced. The ski resort project was worth $340 million. He had been working toward it for 6 years. 6 years of environmental assessments managed with the careful involvement of consultants who understood what conclusions were needed before they began their work. 6 years of county commission meetings and state-level conversations, and a relationship with Senator Harold Pruitt built on fundraising dinners and shared interests, and the kind of mutual understanding that does not require explicit articulation, because explicit articulation creates records, and records create exposure. 6 years of acquiring the parcels between the existing access road and the proposed mountain lift terminus one by one through processes that were legal in the ways that mattered and flexible in the ways that were necessary. The Aldridge parcel was the last one. It was 11 acres of mountainside that had been in the same family for 30 years, homesteaded in the way that people homesteaded things in Colorado before homesteading became a lifestyle choice rather than a survival strategy. And it had belonged to a man named Thomas Aldridge, who had played guitar and grown a garden and raised a daughter and died of a fever 2 winters ago, along with his wife leaving the property in a legal condition that was, depending on your relationship with the statutes governing abandoned property in Cresval County, either complicated or straightforward. Voss's relationship with those statutes was very straightforward. He took a sip of coffee. He looked at the shack. The single amber window was still lit, which meant the girl was still inside, which meant Craw Denton would need to go to the door before the bulldozer could begin its work, which was a procedural requirement Voss found mildly irritating but understood as necessary. The liability architecture of what they were doing tonight required specific sequencing. The occupant was notified. The occupant declined to vacate. The structure was condemned under the abandoned property statute. The bulldozer did what bulldozers do. By the time any formal challenge could be organized through any legitimate legal channel, the structure would be a memory and the groundbreaking would be scheduled, and the momentum of a $340 million project would be the most effective legal argument available. Voss had learned this particular lesson early in his career. Momentum properly managed was more durable than permission. He looked at his phone. Denton had radioed 20 minutes ago. Everything was in position. The bulldozer operator had been paid an emergency overnight rate twice the standard and told the work was straightforward and would take less than an hour. 2 men from Denton's informal crew, not deputies, not county employees, just men available for cash, who did not ask questions about why cash was the preferred medium, were positioned near the access road. It was 4:53 in the morning. In approximately 40 minutes, the Aldridge parcel would be vacant, and the structure on it would be rubble, and Clifton Voss would drive back down the mountain and make 2 phone calls, one to the resort's lead investor and one to Senator Pruitt's office. And the process that had been 6 years in preparation would move into its final phase. He had not given explicit instructions about the girl. He was careful about explicit instructions. What he had said twice to Denton in language that Denton had understood, without requiring elaboration, was that once the property was vacant and the structure was cleared, there should be no further complications with that particular parcel. Denton understood how to manage complications. This was the primary quality that made him useful. There was something Voss did not know as he sat in his heated Suburban, watching the amber window and drinking his cold weather coffee. He did not know that 6 months ago, a 4th-grade teacher named Ruth Kavanaugh had filed a welfare check referral with the county education office, documenting that a child of school age was not enrolled and was believed to be residing alone on the upper mountain. He did not know this because Denton had intercepted the referral and called Ruth Kavanaugh 3 days later with the specific politeness of a man who understands that the most effective kind of pressure is the kind that does not announce itself as pressure. What Voss did know, what he had always known from the first property survey 2 years ago, was that there was a child on that parcel. He had read the assessor's notes. He had seen the welfare flags in the county system. He had called Denton and said in words he had since allowed himself to forget, "Make sure nobody follows up on this." He had known, he had chosen. This distinction would matter later. It did not trouble him now. Voss took another sip of coffee and felt the particular settled confidence of a man who has done the preparation and is waiting for the result. He did not feel the first vibration. It came through the chassis of the Suburban before it came through the air, a low-frequency transmission through metal and road and frozen ground that registered in the body before the mind caught up with it. His coffee rippled slightly in the thermos. He noticed this without understanding it and then felt it again stronger and looked at the cup and looked at the road. Then it became sound. Not sound with edges, not the kind you locate in a specific direction and assess as coming from a specific source. Sound that arrived as pressure rather than volume that moved through the chest before it reached the ears, built from many identical sounds, layered until the layering had produced something categorically different from any of its components, something that was less like sound and more like weather. Clifton Voss set down his thermos. He looked toward the valley road, toward the first curve where the mountain turned, and the long straight descent from the upper pass resolved into the flat approach to the clearing where the shack stood. And he understood completely physically, without the intermediary of thought, that the situation on Crestfall Mountain had just changed in a way that his preparation had not accounted for. The headlights came around the curve first. Not headlights in the ordinary sense. Modified high intensity, the kind that crossed into a different category of brightness, the kind that turned pre-dawn dark into something approaching noon. They came around the curve in a column too wide to be a single lane of traffic and too long to resolve its full length from where Voss was sitting, and as they came, they brought the sound with them. Building as more of the column cleared the curve, and more engines added their contribution to what had already become something enormous. Denton had been halfway to the shack door. He turned around. He stood completely still with the loudspeaker hanging from his hand and his breath coming out in small white clouds that the wind took immediately, and he looked at the column of lights coming down the mountain road, and his face did the thing that faces do when the calculation they have been running encounters a variable it was not built to accommodate. The bulldozer operator, a man named Terry, who had taken this job because overnight emergency rates were twice the standard, and who had no particular feelings about the work itself, looked at the lights and listened to the sound building down the mountain road, and completed a series of rapid personal assessments in under 5 seconds. He turned off the engine. He did not get out of the cab. He sat and watched and had decided without articulating it in so many words that whatever was about to happen on this mountain was not something the overnight emergency rate compensated for. Garrett Maddox came around the curve at the head of the column. He was 54 years old and had been riding for 31 years, and there was nothing about the way he rode that was not deliberate. He assessed the scene the moment it became visible. The bulldozer, the 2 county vehicles, the cluster of men between them, the shack with its single amber window awake, and made the decisions that needed to be made without breaking his line or his speed. The signal went back through the column, the way signals go through a formation that has ridden together long enough to communicate without words, and the column behind him began to do what it was built to do. 150 motorcycles. 3 chapters Iron Pass Ridgeline from the North Valley Black Creek from the western slope. Stone had made the calls between 3:15 and 3:50 in the morning, working through the list of people who answered before the second ring, when Iron Pass called, because there were debts in that direction that had not yet been settled. The debts were various in their origin, some operational favors extended across years in the currency of men who do difficult things in difficult places. Some personal, the kind of debt that accumulates when someone shows up in the right place at the right time, and the showing up cannot be repaid in any standard way, and so sits instead in a category that waits for its moment. All of them involved Decker Holt in one way or another. Stone had not made this a complicated ask. He had said what was happening and where and when and what was needed, and the people on the other end had said versions of the same thing, which was a time check and a confirmation, and they had gotten on their bikes in the dark and the cold and the last hours of a dying storm and ridden up a mountain because Decker Holt had asked for help, and in the accounting system that governed these relationships, Decker Holt asking for help was an event that did not happen often enough to take lightly. The formation spread as it entered the flat, not disordered, purposeful. Riders peeling left and right from the column's head in movements that had the quality of something practiced, though they had not been practiced because men who have ridden together long enough develop a grammar of movement that does not require rehearsal. They spread and settled, and within 90 seconds, 150 motorcycles had formed a wall on three sides of the scene engines at a low idle headlights all forward. The combined brightness illuminating the snow and the machinery, and the men standing between them with light that had no softness in it. Denton looked at his badge. He looked at the formation. He looked at the badge again. He raised it. "This is official county business," he said. His voice still had its shape, the shape of a man accustomed to using those words as both statement and conclusion, but something in the structure behind them had shifted. "You need to clear this area immediately." Stone sat on his bike and looked at him. He did not move. He did not speak. He simply looked at Denton the way a man looks at something whose time has passed and which has not yet been informed of this fact. Then the shack door opened. Decker Holt stood in the doorway. He had 6 inches and considerable physical authority over the man beside the bulldozer, and the look on his face was the look of a man who has spent the night running calculations and has arrived at a number he is comfortable with. He stepped off the porch. He covered the ground between himself and Denton in the measured way of someone who is not in a hurry because they are confident about the destination. He was aware peripherally of Nora in the doorway behind him. He was aware of her the way he had been aware of her all night, not as a factor to be managed, but as a presence with its own gravity that pulled things toward it and organized them around itself without doing anything that could be described as active. She was standing in the doorway in his cut that came to her knees with the iron pass patch facing forward, watching everything with the complete attention of someone who intends to understand correctly what is happening in front of them. He reached Denton. Denton raised the gun. His hand was not entirely steady, which Decker attributed partly to the cold and partly to the 150 sets of headlights behind him. And he looked at the gun the way he looked at most things pointed at him, with the assessment of someone who has had a number of things pointed at him across his adult life and has learned to distinguish between genuine intention and a man who has run out of other responses. He kept walking. The technique had been taught to him at Fort Drum by an instructor whose methods were not designed for the comfort of the men being instructed, but whose lessons had a durability that justified the discomfort. It took 1.5 seconds. It ended with the gun on the ground, and Denton's arm at an angle it was not designed to maintain, and Denton on one knee in the snow, producing sounds of someone whose confidence in the situation has undergone rapid revision. Decker picked up the gun. He ejected the magazine and put it in his jacket pocket and set the empty gun down in the snow at Denton's knee. He reached down and took the badge from Denton's coat firmly without theater. He looked down at Denton. "That badge represents something," he said. "You may have forgotten what, but the people on that road behind me haven't, and they're going to want it back in better condition than you've kept it." He stood up. In the heated Suburban, Clifton Voss had been watching all of this. He had watched the gun and watched Decker and watched the 150 men arranged in a wall of light behind the one man standing in front of his deputy, and the coffee was entirely cold in the thermos, and his phone had rung 11 times in the last 25 minutes, and he had not answered because he was still in the part of the situation where he believed that not answering was a form of control. He watched Denton on one knee in the snow. He reached for the door handle. This was instinct, and Voss was not primarily an instinct-driven man, but the instinct was old and deep. The instinct of a man who had spent 20 years walking into rooms and changing them by the fact of his presence, by the weight of his voice, and the authority that accumulates in a person who had spent 2 decades being the largest source of money and consequence in a particular geography. He had talked his way out of things. He had talked his way into things. He had stood in rooms full of people who needed something from him, and he had always understood that the need was leverage, and the leverage was his. He got the door open. The cold hit him like a physical argument. "Do you have any idea," he said, stepping out onto the snow. He was addressing Decker. He was addressing all of them. His voice found its register, the register of a man who has spoken to rooms full of people who needed things from him and had never been in a room where that was not the case. Who I am, what this project means to this county, what I can have done to every one of you by Monday morning. I have the governor on speed dial. I have federal judges at my fundraisers. You think a pack of Mr. Voss. The voice came from the gap in the formation. Calm, carrying well. The voice of someone who has spent a significant portion of their professional life speaking in rooms where speaking clearly was the most important thing and had become very good at it. My name is Diane Weller. She came through the gap in the formation at 5:12 in the morning, 33 years old, dressed for the weather in a way that made clear she had known she would be here carrying a document case and a tablet and moving with the unhurried confidence of someone who has already completed the work and is now simply delivering the result. Diane had been Iron Pass's legal counsel for 4 years. Before that, she had been a federal prosecutor in the Financial Crimes Division for 6 years. And before that, she had been a law student who graduated second in her class and had taken the federal position specifically because she understood that the cases worth prosecuting were not always the ones that presented themselves in obvious ways, that the most durable corruption was the kind that learned to look like administration. She had been building the Voss file for 14 months. It had started as a side matter reviewing a land transaction involving an access easement near Crestfall. For the chapter, she had noticed anomalies in the county property records that did not resolve into innocence the more closely she looked at them. She had followed the anomalies the way she followed everything methodically and without announcing herself. Building documentation the way a prosecutor builds documentation in the order it will be most useful rather than the order it is discovered. She had 430 pages. She had financial records subpoenaed through a federal civil matter she had filed 6 months ago that Voss's lawyers had not yet understood was about him. She had the LLC structure through which Denton had received 11 years of informal payments registered in Wyoming, carrying Voss's fingerprints in the way financial instruments carry fingerprints when the person creating them is careful but not careful enough. She had been waiting for the right moment. Decker's call to Stone at 3 in the morning had reached her at 3:15. She had been awake. The file was already organized into the submission package she had been refining across the previous 6 weeks against exactly this kind of night. She had needed 45 minutes to add tonight's events: the illegal notice, the non-judicial demolition order, the documented presence of Nora Aldridge as current legal occupant, to the submission narrative. She had filed with the Department of Justice Financial Crimes Division at 4:47 in the morning. She had sent the document package to 4 news organizations at 5:09. I've spent the past 14 months, she said, arriving in front of Voss and holding out the tablet building this. She said it without emphasis, the way you say something that does not require emphasis, because the thing itself is sufficient. Everything, Mr. Voss. The development LLC and the payments to Deputy Denton. The land acquisitions that bypass the county court process. The federal preservation funds diverted through your resort project's environmental assessment, which was not an assessment, but a document produced to reach predetermined conclusions by consultants who have now provided sworn statements to that effect. The senator's involvement. All of it filed with the relevant federal offices at 4:47 this morning with complete documentation. She looked at him steadily. The networks have had the package for 11 minutes. Your phones aren't ringing because you have enemies. They're ringing because your lawyers have read it. Voss looked at the tablet. He looked at his phone, 17 missed calls, the names in the notification bar, a clarifying roster of people who an hour ago would have answered on the first ring. He looked at Diane. He looked at the formation behind her, the wall of light and engine, and the human weight of 150 people who had gotten on bikes in the dark because someone they trusted had asked them to. He opened his mouth. The numbers, Mr. Voss, Diane said. Look at the numbers first. He looked. His development company's stock publicly traded because the resort project had been partially capitalized through a public offering that Senator Pruitt had facilitated through a committee he chaired, had been in free fall since 4:51 in the morning when the first network ran the document package. It was trading at 9 cents per share. The number was still moving in one direction. The money had been the architecture of everything. The money was what made the badge work, and the permits get issued, and the complaints go quiet, and the investigations find other directions to look. The money was the infrastructure behind the infrastructure, the thing that made the visible structure stand. Take the infrastructure away, and what remained was a 53-year-old man standing in sub-zero cold in an expensive coat while 150 people looked at him and the federal charges loaded on a tablet in a woman's hand, and his phone rang and rang with calls from people who had already decided what the calls were about. Clifton Voss sat down in the snow, not deliberately, not as a choice. His legs completed their professional relationship with the rest of him in the specific way that legs do when the system running them concludes that the current situation no longer requires them to maintain the posture of a man who has things under control. He sat in the snow in his expensive coat, with his cold coffee in the Suburban behind him and the formation in front of him, and he looked at the tablet in Diane Weller's hand and understood. With the completeness of a man who built things and therefore recognized when things were fully unmade that it was over. It was at this precise moment that Nora Aldridge came off the porch. She had been in the doorway since Decker had stepped off it. She had watched all of it, the confrontation and the formation, and the gun on the snow and the badge in Decker's hand, and Diane coming through the gap in the riders, and Voss sitting down in the snow. She had watched it with complete attention and without the need to comment on it or perform a response to it. She walked across the snow to where Decker was standing. She stood beside him. She didn't take his hand. She didn't say anything. She just stood beside him in his cut that came to her knees in the combined light of 150 headlights, with the iron pass patch facing forward and her chin level and her gray eyes looking at the man in the expensive coat sitting in the snow. Decker looked down at her. She looked up at him. "Do you think she said he would have liked all this?" He thought about her father, the man in the photograph with the guitar and the worn finish at the sound hole, and his arm around the woman beside him. The man who had said you should know the name of anyone you let into your home, who had built fires on this mountain and raised a daughter who knew how to build them herself. I think Decker said he would have liked the result. She considered this. She nodded once with the gravity of someone who has received an answer that meets the standard she was applying to the question. Behind them, they heard the FBI vehicles before they saw them, 4 unmarked SUVs coming up the valley road at speed that suggested they had been dispatched with urgency by someone who had reviewed the file documents and made a rapid assessment of the field response they required. The duty officer who had received Diane's 447 filing had been a 12-year veteran of the Financial Crimes Unit who recognized the shape of what she was looking at within the first 20 minutes of review. She had authorized field dispatch at 4:53. The vehicles had been rolling since 5:01. They came into the clearing at 5:34. The lead agent, a woman named Farlow, who would describe the scene in her subsequent report as unlike anything in my prior experience, while noting that the documentary support for every action taken was among the most complete she had encountered in 12 years of fieldwork, assessed the scene in a single pass, and began giving instructions to her team in the quiet, precise way of someone who has done this enough times to not require volume to convey authority. They were thorough, they were professional, they did not waste time. Decker watched from where he stood. Nora stood beside him. They watched Voss help to his feet and guided to one of the federal vehicles. They watched Denton helped up from the snow. His arm would require medical attention, which the federal team had already radioed for, and walked to a second vehicle. They watched Diane hand her document case to the lead agent and speak with her for 6 minutes in the organized way that Diane did everything completely without wasted motion. The bulldozer operator got out of the cab at some point during all of this, walked to his truck, and drove down the mountain. Nobody stopped him. Nobody had any particular use for him. When it was done and the federal vehicles had completed their initial work, and the formation had settled from its high idle vigilance into something quieter, and the first gray of actual dawn was beginning to show above the eastern ridgeline, Nora turned from the scene and looked at the shack. She looked at it the way she had looked at the wooden chair before she broke it, not with grief, but with the calm attention of someone completing an honest accounting of what they have. It was a single room. It was cold in the mornings and colder at night, and the gap in the north wall had been covered with plastic sheeting for the last winter and a half, and the door didn't sit level in its frame, and the window had a crack in the lower left corner sealed with candle wax. It was hers. It had been her father's and her mother's, and it was hers. And it was the place where the photograph and the guitar were. And it was the place where she had built fires and eaten soup and slept through 2 winters alone. And it was in the full accounting of everything she possessed in the world. Everything she possessed in the world. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked up at Decker. "Do you think," she said, and then stopped. She looked back at the shack. She started again. "Do you think it could be better?" Decker looked at the shack. He looked at Stone, who had come off his bike and was standing 15 feet away, with the expression of a man who has already had this thought and has already begun making calls. Stone met his eyes. He nodded once. "Yeah," Decker said. He looked down at Nora. He felt something move in the place where he had kept things he had decided not to feel for 7 years, and the feeling was not comfortable, and he did not look away from it, and it was nothing like grief and everything like its opposite. "I think it could be a lot better." Nora Aldridge looked at the shack that had been everything she had, and then looked at the mountain above it, white and brilliant in the first gray of the coming dawn, and she nodded with the gravity of someone who has decided to believe in a thing and intends to act accordingly. "Okay," she said. "The FBI worked with the efficiency of people who have a great deal to do and a precise understanding of how to do it. Agent Farlow ran her team the way good field agents run teams. She told each person what they were responsible for, and then trusted them to be responsible for it, and directed her own attention to the things that required her specifically. 2 agents processed Voss, which involved the removal of his phone and his wallet and his thermos of expensive cold coffee, and the replacement of his expensive coat's freedom of movement with the constraint of federal custody. 2 more handled Denton, whose arm had been assessed by the team's medical support and confirmed as requiring hospital attention, which would be provided after processing and not before, because the order of operations in a federal arrest was not subject to negotiation by the person being arrested. The remaining agents went through both county vehicles with the methodical attention of people who understood that what was in those vehicles was part of a story that needed to be told completely and in the right order. Diane Weller stood with Agent Farlow for 22 minutes. Decker watched them from the edge of the scene, not close enough to hear, close enough to read the quality of the exchange. 2 people who were both very good at their work and recognized that quality in each other, and were therefore able to move through a large amount of material in a short time. Diane had her document case open and was moving through it with the organized precision of someone who had arranged things in the order they would be needed by someone encountering them for the first time. Farlow took what was offered and reviewed it, and asked questions and received answers and took notes, and at the end of 22 minutes she closed her notebook and shook Diane's hand and went back to directing her team. Stone materialized beside Decker at some point during this. He did not announce himself. He simply was there the way Stone was usually simply there when he had decided to be somewhere, and he stood beside Decker and watched the federal team work and said nothing for a while. Then he said, "You doing all right?" Decker considered this question with the seriousness it deserved. His core temperature had returned to something that qualified as functional. His hands had stopped doing the thing they had been doing in the first hour in the shack, the fine involuntary tremor he had kept from the others, because the others had their own versions of it to manage. His legs had resumed their professional relationship with the rest of him. He was alive, which several hours ago had seemed like an outcome that required more favorable conditions than were available. "Yeah," he said. Stone looked at Nora. She was standing at the edge of the porch watching the federal agents work, tracking everything with the attention of someone building a complete picture. She had pulled Decker's cut tighter around her against the morning cold without looking away from the scene. Stone watched her for a moment. "Her parents," Decker said. "Thomas and May Aldridge, 2 years ago." Stone nodded. He did not say anything about this. He was not a man who deployed condolence as a verbal transaction. He understood that some facts required acknowledgement and not commentary, and he acknowledged this one by the quality of his silence. Then he said, "I've got calls to make." He walked back to his bike. What happened next happened the way things happen when a large number of people with specific skills have a clear understanding of what needs to be done and the resources to do it and the motivation to do it correctly. Stone made calls. The calls produced results with the speed of a network built over decades that understood when activated for something like this, that speed was part of the point. A building supply contact in the valley below had his phone answered by Stone at 6:03 in the morning and had material loaded and moving up the mountain road by 6:45. Because the overnight emergency rate Stone offered was significant, and because the contact had known Stone for 11 years and understood that when Stone called at 6 in the morning and said he needed material on a mountain by 7, the appropriate response was to confirm the order and start loading. The material was specific wall studs, insulation, exterior cladding, roofing, a cast iron wood stove with proper pipe fittings, a door and frame a window unit, lumber for framing concrete for the foundation points that had been eroding since the second winter. 50 men from the 3 chapters were already moving before the supply truck cleared the first switchback. They work the way men work when the work has meaning beyond the work itself. Not fast in a sloppy way, not slow in a ceremonial way, but at the pace of people who understand what they are building and why they are building it and have calibrated their effort accordingly. Rex organized the foundation work because Rex had done construction before the chapter and understood load bearing in a way that was practical rather than theoretical. Boone and Harlan, restored to something close to their full operational capacity by warmth and time, and the recuperative power of men who had spent years conditioning their bodies to recover from difficult things, took the south wall because it was the most compromised and required the most attention. Others worked the roof, others the framing, others the stove installation, working from the pipe down to confirm the draw before the stove was set and the connections made permanent. Boone had slipped away from the south wall sometime around 6:30. Rex covered for him without being asked, which was consistent with how Rex operated and had driven down the mountain and back in under an hour. He had a purpose that he had not announced to anyone because it did not need announcing. It either worked or it did not, and announcing it before it worked would have been the wrong order of operations. Nora stood on the porch and watched for a while. Then she went inside. She went to the north wall and stood in front of the photograph. Her father and her mother and the mountain behind them and the guitar in her father's hand. She stood there for a long time without moving long enough that Decker, who had come inside to check on the stove installation progress, and found her there, stopped and stood behind her and said nothing because there was nothing to say that the moment needed. She reached out and touched the edge of the photograph frame. Her fingers rested on the wood for a moment. Then she looked at the guitar on the peg beside it. She had not looked at the guitar directly since the night before. She had looked at everything else in the room across the night. The fire, the soup, the faces of the men on her floor, the window ticking in the wind, but she had not looked directly at the guitar. Decker had noticed this and understood that the not looking was deliberate and had respected it without comment. She looked at it now. She reached out and took it down from the peg. She held it the way you hold something that has its own specific weight, and you know the weight well and have always known it. She ran her thumb across the strings, which had gone slightly out of tune from the cold and the damp, and the sound they made was the sound of something that had not been played in 2 years and missed it. She held it for another moment. Then she looked at Decker. He played it every evening, she said. After dinner, even when there wasn't much dinner. Decker looked at the guitar. At the wear pattern around the sound hole, the finish gone smooth and dark from years of a particular hand in a particular position. The instrument of a man who had played every evening because the playing was not a choice but a need. He sounds, Decker said, like a man who knew what mattered. Nora looked at the guitar in her hands. She looked at the fire in the old grate where the last of the broken chair had long since burned to ash. She looked at the wall where the peg was. She hung the guitar back on the peg. She straightened it so it hung level. She stepped back and looked at it. Okay, she said, not to Decker, To the room or to herself or to the man in the photograph. She said it the way she said most things, without performance, without qualification. Just the word and the tone of someone completing a necessary conversation with someone who deserved the completion. She went back outside. The town came at first light. They came the way towns come when something large has happened at the edge of their awareness overnight, drawn not by any single piece of information, but by the accumulation of signals that aggregate in a community, the way weather aggregates the three-word text messages circulating since before 5. The sound that had moved through the valley in the early dark and registered in the sleep of people who lived close enough to the mountain to feel it. The quality of the light on the upper road that suggested activity of a kind and scale that did not belong to ordinary early morning. They came in ones and twos, and then in small groups, parking at the edge of the clearing and walking forward and stopping when they saw what was in front of them. Stopping and standing and looking and understanding in stages, the way you understand something that does not fit the category you brought to it. The formation of bikes still arranged in their three-sided wall. Though the engines were quiet now, the riders standing or sitting or moving to help with construction in whatever way they could contribute. The federal vehicles at the far edge of the flat, the county Suburban sitting empty with its doors still open from when Voss had gotten out of it. The shack, which was in the process of becoming something else, new wall cladding, going up on two sides, already the roof being reboarded above. The sounds of construction coming from inside and outside simultaneously with the organized quality of work that knows what it's doing. And on the porch, Nora Aldridge. She was watching the town come the way she watched everything else, directly and completely, and without adjusting her expression to communicate anything beyond what she was actually thinking, which was her consistent approach to all situations, regardless of their scale. Decker stood behind her. He had been standing behind her for the better part of the last hour, in the way of someone who is not guarding, but is present, which is a different thing. A distinction that matters to people who understand the difference between protection as control and protection as commitment. The people from the town stood at the edge of the clearing and looked at the shack and looked at the formation and looked at the construction happening around them and looked at Nora on the porch. Some of them had known. This was the thing that moved through the crowd in the early light without requiring words, the communal knowledge of a thing that has been known and not acted on, which is a different kind of knowing than ignorance and carries a different weight. They had known that Thomas and May Aldridge had died 2 winters ago. They had known at the level of rumor and inference and the deliberate not asking that communities practice around things they are not prepared to formally address, that the girl was up there on the mountain. Some of them had seen her in the valley in the months after at the general store at the edge of the county road, a small figure in a thin jacket buying things one at a time with the economy of someone for whom each purchase was a calculation. Some of them had known about Voss and the resort project in the Aldridge parcel and what the parcel's legal status was becoming and what would be required to complete its transition. They had known the way people know things about the people who hold power in the places where they live through the accumulation of things seen and things heard and things that don't quite add up, and the decision made repeatedly and individually and then collectively. That knowing is not the same as acting, and that acting has costs that knowing does not. They stood in the early light of a morning, after a night they had not been part of, and understood, without anyone saying it, what the difference between knowing and acting looked like, when you could see it clearly. Ruth Kavanaugh stood at the back of the crowd. She was 61 years old and had been teaching 4th grade at Crestfall Elementary for 19 years. And she had the posture of someone who is standing where they are standing because they have not yet decided whether they have the right to stand somewhere else. She had a blue coat and gray hair and the kind of face that showed what it was thinking, regardless of what the person attached to it preferred. She had filed the welfare check referral 6 months ago, documented that a child of school age was not enrolled and was believed to be residing alone on the upper mountain. She had filed it because it was required and because it was right and because she had not been able to stop thinking about the girl she had seen twice at the general store buying soup and crackers, paying in coins, counted out carefully from a Ziploc bag. Craw Denton had called her 3 days after she filed. The call had been polite. That was the thing she had carried with her across the 6 months since the politeness of it, the courtesy of a man who understood that the most effective kind of pressure is the kind that does not announce itself as pressure. He had not said, "Don't follow up." He had said something about the complexity of the jurisdictional issues involved and the ongoing assessment by the relevant county offices and the importance of not creating confusion in an active review process. He had mentioned in passing that the county education budget was up for review and that the school board appointments that govern such reviews were made by the county commissioner's office. She had understood. She had not followed up. She had thought about it across 6 months in the way that people think about things they have chosen not to do in the margins of other things, in the moments before sleep and after waking, in the way a sound continues after its source is stopped. She had told herself the things that people tell themselves about the choices available to them and the things beyond their individual power to change, and the ways in which the system would eventually address what the system was designed to address. She had known a child was alone on a mountain. She had chosen. She stood at the back of the crowd in the early light and looked at Nora on the porch. Nora looked back at her. Ruth Kavanaugh had been in front of groups of children for 19 years, and she understood children the way you understand something you have given the better part of your adult attention to, in the specific and not the general, the individual child, rather than the category. She understood looking at Nora Aldridge, looking back at her from the porch of a shack being rebuilt around her, that this was a child who did not need to be told what Ruth's expression meant, who had already read it and understood it and was waiting with the patience of someone who has learned to be patient about things that matter to see what Ruth was going to do with it. Ruth Kavanaugh walked forward through the crowd. People moved for her without being asked. She came to the edge of the porch. She looked up at Nora. Nora looked back down at her. "I'm sorry," Ruth said. She said it the way people say things when they mean them more than they know how to say them, simply without elaboration. Because elaboration would have been a way of managing the weight of it rather than carrying it. "I should have done more. I knew you were up here, and I let someone tell me not to look, and I should have looked anyway." Nora was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I know." Not as an accusation, as information. As the simple acknowledgement of someone who has always known the thing that is being confessed and has simply been waiting for the confession to happen. Ruth nodded. She had the expression of someone who has set down something they have been carrying for 6 months and found that the setting down was both a relief and its own weight, not lighter exactly, but differently distributed. "Can I come up?" she said. Nora considered her for a moment, the pause of someone who takes decisions seriously and is taking this one seriously. Then she moved aside on the porch, a gesture of welcome that was not theatrical, just functional. The gesture of someone who has decided a thing and is acting on the decision. Ruth came up onto this porch. She stood beside Nora. They both looked at the clearing at the formation and the construction and the people from the town standing in the early light, and they did not say anything else for a while. And that was all right. Some silences are not empty. Some silences are what happens after something true has been said, and both people are taking the time to let it settle into the permanent record. Stone found Decker at the east wall of the shack where the new cladding was going up. He had a document in his hand folded with Diane Weller's letterhead at the top. He held it out without preamble. "Diane drew it up this morning," he said, "between 4:47 and when she got here." Decker took it. He unfolded it and read it. He read it twice. It was a trust document, precise and complete in the way that Diane's work was always precise and complete, organized around three primary provisions. The first was a property trust establishing clear legal title to the Aldridge parcel, all 11 acres in Nora Aldridge's name held in trust until her 18th birthday, with a designated trustee, which was Decker Holt, listed by full legal name. The second was an educational fund, capitalized at an amount contributed by the three chapters in the hours before dawn, sufficient to cover full tuition and expenses at any accredited institution through a graduate degree. The third was a monthly income provision funded from a chapter account Stone had established in the night, sufficient for living expenses at a standard that was not extravagant and was not inadequate index to inflation running until Nora was old enough to manage the larger provisions herself. At the bottom in Diane's precise hand was a note. The property title filing has already been submitted to the county recorder's office. Given the federal actions against Commissioner Voss this morning, I anticipate no complications. Decker looked at Stone. Stone said, she's been alone for 2 years. He said it the way he said things that did not require elaboration, which was without elaboration. That ends today. Decker folded the document carefully. He looked at the shack at the new wall going up at Nora on the porch with Ruth Kavanaugh standing beside her. He looked at the guitar visible through the new window hanging on its peg on the north wall, and he looked at the empty peg beside it. He thought about what Boone had gone down the mountain to do. There was a vest. One of the Iron Pass members, a quiet man named Aldous Pruitt, who had been with the chapter for 8 years, and who had in his previous life worked as a tailor and retained both the skill and the patience that tailoring requires, had spent the hours before dawn with a spare cut of Decker's in a seam ripper and a needle and thread. He had cut the leather down with the attention of someone doing something that needs to be done once and done right, resizing it from the dimensions of a 285-pound man to the dimensions of an 8-year-old girl who was small for her age and had been eating 1 can of soup per day for longer than anyone who knew about it was comfortable knowing. He had restitched the seams with doubled thread. On the back-end lettering that he had laid out and transferred and cut freehand because there was no other option available at 4 in the morning on a mountain, 2 words. Angel's Keeper. Decker took it from Aldous with a nod that carried more than a nod usually carries, and Aldous received it with the nod of someone who understands that some things don't need to be said aloud to be said completely. He crossed to the porch. Nora watched him come. She watched him the way she watched everything with complete attention and without the need to perform any particular response to what she was seeing. Ruth stepped back slightly to give him room, not far, just enough. Decker crouched down to Nora's level. He was holding the vest. She looked at it. She looked at the patch on the front, the Iron Pass insignia. She moved her eyes to his face. He turned it around so she could see the back. She read the 2 words. She read them again in the way people read things they want to be sure they have read correctly. "What does it mean?" she said. Decker looked at her. He thought about how to say a true thing in a way that was sufficient to the truth of it, which is the hardest part of saying true things. "It means," he said, "that you kept 4 of us alive last night with a chair and a can of soup and a fire you built yourself. It means you did that in the last hours of the only home you had, and you did it without being asked and without expecting anything back." He paused. "And it means that we are going to spend a considerable amount of time making sure you're all right from here on out, whether you like it or not." She held his gaze for a moment. Something moved in her eyes, not tears, something quieter than that, something more interior. The expression of someone who has been waiting for a long time for a thing to be true and is now in the process of determining whether it actually is. "I like it," she said. She said it without hesitation, with the directness of someone who has had enough experience with things not being all right to recognize immediately when something is. He helped her into the vest. It fit more or less. Aldous had done his best with dimensions estimated from a distance in the dark, and the result was close enough to be right in the ways that mattered. She pulled the front straight on her shoulders and turned to look at her reflection in the new window glass. She looked at the patch on the back in the reflection. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Papa would have liked this." "Tell me about him sometime," Decker said. She thought about this, not about whether she wanted to, but about where to start, the way people think about beginning a story that has a lot of beginning. "He played guitar," she said, "every evening, even in the summer when it was hot, even when there wasn't much to be happy about. He said the music was for the mountain as much as for us. He said the mountain deserved to hear something good." Decker looked at the guitar on the wall inside, visible through the new window, hanging on its peg on the north wall. He thought about what it would have sounded like in the evenings on this mountain, in this room, with the mountain outside going through its seasons, and a family in that photograph being a family. He looked at the empty peg beside the guitar, the peg where something had hung once and no longer hung. He was still looking at it when Boone came back up the porch steps. Boone had been gone just over an hour. He had driven down the mountain to the Valley Print Service that opened at 6, having sent the file at 5:58. The photograph he had taken at some point between 4 and 5 in the morning. A photograph of Nora standing at the window of the shack in the early dark, looking out at the formation and the headlights in the clearing. She had not known she was being photographed. She had been wearing Decker's cut that came to her knees. The iron pass patch facing forward, her profile lit from outside by the combined light of 150 headlights. She had the expression she always had, the expression of someone paying complete attention to the world in front of them, unwilling to miss any of it. It was the kind of photograph that happens once and cannot be repeated, and that you know when you see it is the real thing. Boone had it printed and mounted in a frame that was simple and the right size, and he had given it to Harlan without explanation, and Harlan had gone inside and done what needed to be done with it. The guitar hung on its peg on the north wall. Beside it on the peg where nothing had hung since the guitar was there alone, there was now a photograph of Nora Aldridge in the early dark with a light of 150 headlights on her face and an iron pass cut coming to her knees and the expression of someone paying complete attention to the world. It was in a frame. It was level. It was exactly the right size for the space. Decker looked at it through the window. Then he looked at Nora. "Come inside," he said. "There's something you should see." She came inside. She stood in front of the north wall and looked at the guitar on its peg and looked at the photograph beside it. She stood very still. The photograph was of her. She understood this immediately and stood with it the way you stand with something that has given you new information about yourself, and you are taking the time to understand what the information means and whether it changes other things you already know. "That's me," she said. "Yeah," Decker said. "That's you." She looked at the photograph for another moment. Then she looked at the guitar. Then she looked at the photograph again, and she was quiet for a long time, in the way that people are quiet when they are not absent, but more present than usual. "He's still here," she said. She said it quietly, not as a statement requiring agreement, but as a conclusion she had reached by her own process and was stating because stating true things was what she did. "He's still here, and now I'm here too, on the same wall." Decker looked at the north wall, the guitar and the photograph, and the space between them that was not empty anymore, that would not be empty again. "Yeah," he said. "That's right, same wall." She reached out and touched the edge of her photograph frame, the same way she had touched the edge of her father's photograph, earlier fingers resting on the wood for a moment, not checking whether it was real, acknowledging that it was. Then she straightened up and went back outside, and her shoulders were different in some way that Decker noticed, but would not have been able to fully describe. Not taller exactly, but more settled, as if something that had been slightly off-center had found its position. Stone's voice came from outside, not loud, just carrying the voice of a man who has an announcement to make and has chosen his moment. Decker went to the door. Nora came with him. The formation was assembling. Not the static wall of headlights from the hours of confrontation, but something that was moving now. The bikes finding their order from the front of the column. Back riders settling into their seats. The choreography of a formation preparing to move. The people from the town were still in the clearing, had been there through the construction and the arrival of Farlow's team and its departure and the steady work of the morning. And they stood now at the edge of the space and watched the formation assemble with the attention of people who understand they are watching something they will remember. Stone was at the head of it on his bike. He looked at Decker. He looked at Nora. He did not say anything. He did not need to. Decker looked at Nora. She was watching the formation with the same attention she brought to everything reading it, the way she read all things, looking for what it meant under what it appeared to be. "They're leaving," she said. "Yeah," Decker said. She looked at the formation. She looked at Stone at the head of it. She looked at Rex, who was 3 rows back, and who caught her eye and raised one hand in a gesture that was not quite a wave and not quite a salute, and was something between them that they had established in the night through no particular effort, and that would not require effort to maintain. She looked at Decker. "Are you leaving?" He looked at her. He looked at the document in his hand, the one with Diane Weller's letterhead, and his name listed as trustee. He looked at the north wall through the door, the guitar and the photograph, and the space between them that was no longer empty. Not today, he said. And then because she deserved the full answer, and she was the kind of person who would know if she wasn't getting it, and not in the way you're thinking. Trustee means I'm responsible for making sure things go right. He paused. That's not a short job. She considered this with the gravity she brought to information that mattered. How long, she said. He thought about it honestly, the way she deserved. Long enough, he said. She looked at him for another moment. She was 8 years old, and she had been alone for 2 years, and she knew the difference between a true answer and a comfortable one. And she had just received a true answer, and she received it the way she received true things, which was completely and without flinching. Okay, she said. Stone raised one hand at the front of the formation. The signal went back through the column the way signals do through people who have ridden together long enough to share a language not spoken, not formally gestured, just known. The formation began to move. Not away, not yet, just moving the way. Formations move when they are finding their pace. The slow, deliberate roll of 150 bikes in column, discovering their shared rhythm. The sound building from a low idle into something fuller and more sustained as the speed came up incrementally. Each engine adding to what the one before it had already established, until the sound was not a collection of sounds anymore, but a single sustained thing that moved through the clearing and up the mountain face and came back down. Changed the way all sounds come back changed from a mountain. The people from the town watched from the edge of the clearing. Some of them had been crying for a while. Some of them were just beginning to. Some of them were not crying, but had the expression of people in whom something has shifted in a way that does not shift back. Not a dramatic shift, not a conversion, but the particular internal rearrangement that happens when something you have known abstractly becomes something you have seen. And the distance between those two kinds of knowing becomes apparent in a way that cannot be unmade. Ruth Kavanaugh stood on the porch beside Nora. She had her hand on Nora's shoulder lightly in the way of someone offering contact rather than requiring it, and paying attention to whether the offer is welcome. Nora had not moved away from the hand. This was information, and Ruth received it carefully, the way a person receives information they have been hoping for and did not want too much. The formation made a long, slow arc across the flat and came around to face the valley road, and the sound of it, at full idle in the mountain morning, was the sound of people who have paid a debt and understand the value of what they have paid. It was not triumphant, not celebratory, but full of something that was its own thing. The specific resonance of people who have decided together that some things are worth showing up for in the dark and have shown up and are now carrying that knowledge forward into whatever comes next. Decker stood on the edge of the new porch and looked at the formation, at the 150 men who had come down a mountain in a dying storm because he had asked and because they had debts that needed paying, and because those two things in the right combination were sufficient. He thought about what it had cost them in the ordinary currencies: time, sleep, cold, the specific physical discomfort of riding that far in those conditions. And he thought about what it had produced, which was a house on a mountain that was no longer a shack, and a girl on a porch who was no longer alone, and a set of federal charges filed before dawn that would spend the next several years making their way through a system that had been designed at its origin for exactly this kind of use. He thought about Maisie. He thought about the way the not thinking about Maisie had become so practiced across 7 years that he had started to confuse the practice with the thing itself, the silence with the absence of what the silence was about. He thought about Nora asking him last night in the firelight, with the storm outside, whether he thought her father would have liked him, and about the answer he had given, which was that her father would have liked the result, and about how that had been both a true answer and an incomplete one. He thought the complete answer was something closer to this, that a man who played guitar for a mountain every evening because the mountain deserved to hear something good would have understood, without needing it, explained what it meant to show up for something. And that showing up was the part of being a person that Decker Holt had spent 7 years doing imperfectly and was going to spend whatever came next doing better. He faced forward. He opened the throttle. The road came up ahead of him, cold and clean, and running down through the mountain toward whatever came next, and the sound of the formation at his back built from its component engines into the single sustained thing that it became when all of them found the same pace. And in that sound was everything that the night had been, and everything that the morning had changed, and the weight of 150 people who had decided together that some things were worth showing up for in the dark on a mountain in a storm. Nora Aldridge stood on her porch and watched them go. She watched until the last light disappeared around the mountain's first curve. She watched the place where the light had been for a moment after it was gone, the way you watch the place where something was when you want to be sure you have finished watching it properly before you turn away. Then she went inside. She went to the table, the new table larger than the one that had been there before with two chairs that were not broken, and she sat down. She placed the trust document in front of her and held it with both hands lightly, the way she held things she intended to keep. She could not read all of it. It was a legal document, and she was 8 years old, and legal documents are not written for 8-year-olds. But she understood what it was. She had understood what things were, and what they meant at a level below the specific words for longer than she should have had to. She sat with it for a while without trying to do anything with it. Sometimes the right relationship to a thing, at least at first, is simply to hold it and let it be real. Outside through the new window, the mountain was doing what mountains do after storms, revealing itself in stages as the last of the cloud cover pulled back from the upper ridgelines. The snow brilliant and precise in the morning light. Every surface clarified by the night's accumulation into something that looked clean, in a way that things only look after weather has finished with them. The sky above the eastern ridge was the pale gold of a storm that has run its full length and is done. Ruth came inside. She sat in the other chair. She did not say anything immediately. She looked at the photograph on the north wall, Thomas Aldridge with the guitar, and May Aldridge beside him, in the mountain behind them, in a different season. And she looked at the photograph of Nora beside it, the girl in the early dark with the light of 150 headlights on her face, and she was quiet with it all for a while. The stove was putting out real heat now, the kind of heat that a properly built fire in a properly installed stove produces, steady and sustainable and organized, the kind of warmth that intends to last through the morning and through the afternoon and through the night that follows and through all the winters that come after this one. After a while, Nora said, "Will you come back?" Ruth looked at her. "Yes," Ruth said. She said it without qualification, in the tone of someone who understands that a promise made to this particular child in this particular moment is not the kind that admits of hedging or condition. "Often. As often as you'll have me, if that's all right." Nora looked at the document in her hands. She looked at the north wall. She looked at the window and the mountain outside it, white and brilliant and present. "Papa used to say," she said, "that you should know the name of everyone you let into your home." Ruth was quiet for a moment, receiving this fully before she responded to it. "My name is Ruth," she said. Nora nodded. "I know," she said. Outside, the town was going home. They went in the same ones and twos and small groups they had come in, back down the mountain road, and back through the valley, and back to the ordinary structure of their mornings. But they went differently than they had come. They went carrying something that had not been in them when they came up the mountain. Something without a simple name, but having to do with the distance between what a person knows and what a person does, and what that distance looks like when you have stood in the early light of a morning after a night like this one and seen it laid out plainly in front of you. Some of them would do things differently because of it. Some of them would not, because that is the nature of these moments. They do not transform everyone equally or permanently or in the same direction. But the knowledge does not leave. It stays in the place where true things stay, below the level of daily decision, in the part of a person that keeps the account of what they have witnessed and what they understood when they witnessed it. It becomes part of the permanent record. And the permanent record matters even when, especially when its effects are slow and not always visible from the outside. Ruth Kavanaugh would file a new welfare check for every child in her district within the following 2 weeks. She would follow up on each one personally. She would do this not because the system required it, but because she had stood on a porch in the early morning and looked at a child who had spent 2 winters alone on a mountain and had finally understood in the way that only seeing can teach what the difference between knowing and acting cost when the cost was paid by someone else. In the shack that was not a shack anymore, Nora Aldridge sat at her table with a trust document in front of her, and the guitar on the wall, and the photograph of her father, and the photograph of herself side by side on the north wall, and the new stove putting out the warmth of a fire that has been properly built and properly fed and intends to last. She had opened a door in a blizzard. She had broken her only chair and given away her last can of soup and stood in the cold without a coat to wave four strangers in from the dark. She had done it because her father had told her that you help people who need help, and that is just what you do. And she had believed him the way children believe the true things their parents tell them completely without reservation, without requiring evidence. Because the person telling them has already earned that kind of belief through the consistent daily work of being the kind of person whose word is worth that much. What had come back through that door in the end was a table with two chairs and a stove that worked, and a document that said the mountain was hers, and a vest with her name on the back of it, and a woman named Ruth sitting in the other chair, and a photograph on the wall that said she was still here and still becoming the person her father had been raising her to be when he ran out of time to finish the raising. The raising was not finished. She understood this. There was more of it ahead of her than behind her, more of it than she could currently see the shape of. But the shape was no longer entirely unknown, and the people who would help her find it were no longer entirely absent, and the house she would grow into herself in was warm and level and capable of winter. She set the document down flat on the table. She smoothed it once with the flat of her hand. She looked at the north wall, both photographs, her father and her mother and the mountain in a different season. Herself in the early dark with the light of 150 headlights on her face paying attention. She looked at the guitar. She had never learned to play it. She had been too young when her father was alive, and then he was gone, and the guitar had been too much of him to touch without it becoming something she couldn't hold. But she was 8 years old, and 8-year-olds have more time ahead of them than they know what to do with, and the guitar was on the wall, and the mountain was outside the window, and her father had said the mountain deserved to hear something good. Someday, she thought, not today, but someday. She looked at the window at the mountain outside it, white and brilliant in the morning light. The same mountain that had always been there, that had been there in her father's photograph and in her mother's garden, and in every morning she had woken to since she could remember waking. The mountain that had tried to unmake things last night and had failed. It was still there. So was she.